This is Grand Canyon Railway's 282 Mikado number 4960. Built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, rolled off the erecting shop floor in the summer of 1923. Now, I've done a couple videos on 4960 over the years. I did one for Grand Canyon Railway's Facebook channel back in 2020 and another one for their YouTube channel shortly thereafter. But those were more basic overviews of the locomotive. I'm going to do here a more in-depth, more detailed tour of 4960, more about how things work. So let's check it out. Hi, I'm Eric, and welcome to my channel. What's it about? Well, pretty much whatever I want. I've always been a photographer, and with this channel I have a new outlet to showcase those images I've collected over the years and are still collecting. My goal? To take things I'm interested in and share them with all of you. You might find yourself going to a place you've never heard of or learning about something you never understood. So stick with me, and you never know what's coming up next. Well, I guess we'll start here at the rear of the locomotive, at the back of the tender. We're getting 4960 ready for a upcoming trip, so we're taking on water. Right here, we've got a water softener inside the building that we use in order to fill the tender. The tender holds 18,000 gallons of water and 3,800 gallons of oil. So other things you're going to notice here on the tender, at the top, there is, of course, a headlight, and there's also a plug for your MU connection. This is a 27-pin electrical connection, so when we're running with the diesel helper behind us, this controls all the electrical systems on the diesel locomotive. And then also for the MU system, you're going to notice a series of hoses. Now, the one in the middle is your standard brake pipe hose that runs down the length of the train from the locomotive through all the cars to control the air brakes on the entire train. But on the outside, you're going to see three hoses. So of those three hoses, the one on the inside is the main reservoir hose. The main reservoir hose is used to connect the main reservoirs on each locomotive. Each locomotive has an air compressor, and it pumps up a reservoir that's used in order to operate the brake systems. Now, usually the lead locomotive and the locomotive consist are the only one that actually is in control of the air brakes, but you connect all the hoses together between the locomotives to give you extra capacity for storage of air, so that gives you more capacity in order to be able to charge the train. Now, the next hose on the inside is the actuate hose, which is used when you want to bail off locomotives in the consist. So if you apply the automatic air brakes on the train, it'll set the brakes on all the cars and the locomotive consist. But sometimes you don't want the locomotive brakes to set up, probably for train handling, or maybe you don't want to wear out the more expensive wheels on the locomotives versus the more inexpensive wheels on the cars. So if you want the locomotive brakes to release, but still keep the brakes applied on the rest of the train, you're going to bail off the brakes, and that's the actuation hose is going to send air to each of the locomotives in the locomotive consist in order to bail off the locomotive brakes. The outside hose is the application and release hose. This one is used in order to apply the locomotive brakes separate from the automatic brakes. So this is used for the independent brake control to apply and release brakes on all the locomotives. In this MU system, the 27-pin electrical connection and the air brake hoses are the same on this steam locomotive versus any diesel electric locomotive. They all use the same technology and the same system. Now, something else you're going to notice here on the back of the tender that you're not typically going to find on steam locomotives, and in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if 4960 right now is the only steam locomotive that has this, is that little red canister right there. Now, this little red canister connects your 480 volt three-phase electrical system to the rest of the train. And there's a little story by how we decided to install this on the locomotive. So the locomotive is equipped with two dynamos. A dynamo is a electric generator driven by steam through a turbine to generate 32 volts DC electric power in order to power headlights, radios, things like that on the steam locomotive. Well, 4960 is equipped with two dynamos, and we really only need one for the onboard systems. So we usually use one as a primary and the other one as a backup. So on a particular steam run, we had one of our dynamos was down and we knew it was broken and it needed some parts, and we were in the process of acquiring the parts for it. We had a steam run coming up, no big deal. We have a backup dynamo and we'll just run the backup. So on the particular day that the steam locomotive was being fired up, they started the backup dynamo and it didn't work, and it was having issues with maintaining voltage and blowing fuses, and they couldn't get it to work right, and they didn't have enough time to fix it before the engine was scheduled to leave, and so they had to cancel the steam run and put a diesel locomotive in its place. And yes, if you take the steam engine off the train, you still have to put a diesel in its place because we need two locomotives in order to pull our train to the canyon. So it's not like they could just run the train with the one diesel they had. If you watch my video on why you put a diesel locomotive behind a steam engine, I explained that on Grand Canyon Railway, it's tonnages that basically dictate whether or not we need a diesel helper. So anyway, as we were very disappointed that we had to cancel the steam locomotive for the day because we didn't have a functioning dynamo, neither of our dynamos were functioning, we came to the realization that we've got these big electric generators back on the train that produce 480 volts, three-phase, in order to power all the air conditioning and heating systems and lights and refrigerators and things back on the passenger cars. So why don't we use that electricity that's back on the train that we have every day and run that up to the steam locomotive in order to run the lights and the radio instead of the dynamos, and save some wear and tear on the dynamos. We can leave them shut down, and hopefully they'll last a little longer and won't need repairs as often. So in order to accomplish this, we put a 480 volt three-phase head-end power connection on the back of the tender, and that 480 volts three-phase is stepped down with the transformer on the back of the tender to 220, and then that runs up to the front of the tender where it goes down to 110, and then from there to another transformer to convert it to 32 volts DC to run all the power systems on the steam locomotive. So moving down the side of the tender on the fireman's side, we've got a couple toolboxes where we keep our supplies. Now this particular one here has a gas-powered water pump that pumps at about 200 gallons per minute. The south rim of the Grand Canyon in the village gets its water from a spring which is down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon on north side of the Colorado River and about halfway up on the north side. So the water has to be pumped from the bottom of the Grand Canyon up to the south rim of the canyon, and that's very expensive. Water in northern Arizona is at a premium. There's not a huge amount of water available up here. So we don't take water from the south rim of the canyon from its limited water supply. Instead, when we need water up at the south rim for the steam engine in order to make a return trip back, we take water up in 16,000 gallon tank cars ahead of time, park them on the spur at the end of the tail of the Y by the Maswick backcountry office, and we use this gas-powered water pump in order to transfer water from tank cars onto the tender in order to replenish our supply in order to make our trip back to Williams. Now, back in Williams, water is not as limited in quantity as it is up at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, but it is still a limited quantity, and we try to avoid taking water from the municipality any more than we have to for steam services. So we collect precipitation, rain, and snowmelt here in this reclamation pond and use it for the steam locomotives whenever we can. So we'll pump it from here into our 16,000 gallon tank cars, then run it through a water softener for boiler use. And we also take it from the roof right here, which also drains into this reclamation pond, and that's where we collect our rainwater. Moving forward again, here in the connection between the locomotive and the tender, we've got our drawbars, which connect the engine and tender, and the FRA requires that you have to have two means to connect the locomotive and the tender. For 4960, we have two drawbars, so one primary and one is a backup. And while the drawbar keeps the locomotive and tender connected during tension, if you have compression and buff forces when you're making backup moves or slack, you want to be able to keep that joint tight. And so we have what's called a radial buffer. The buffer is in several pieces, and the two mating pieces are in a radius, so one on the steam locomotive and one on the tender. The piece on the tender has springs behind it to keep pressure on it constantly, so it's always a tight fit up against the locomotive. And of course, you have to grease that because it's two mating surfaces that move. You have to keep it greased in order to make sure that the pieces slide back and forth reasonably. Also here between the engine and tender, we've got another transformer under the tender deck in order to bring our voltage down from 220 to 110, and then also to 32 volt DC. We've also got our fuel connection between the tender and the locomotive that our fuel travels through from the storage in the tender in order to go up to the burner on the locomotive. And we've got a couple other electrical connections here because we've got lights on the tender and the toolboxes and on the rear, and so we have a couple electrical connections for that. Now, right under the cab is our non-lifting injector. The FRA requires that you have to have two means in order to get water from the tender in order to put it in the boiler, in order to replenish the water that you're using in the boiler. So this is one of them. You can have a lifting or a non-lifting injector. We have a non-lifting injector, which means that it has to be below the bottom of the tender because water is going to flow into the injector by gravity. The injector works on Bernoulli's principle. Inside the injector, you've got a couple of nozzles. We call them cones. And it's like your nozzle at the end of a garden hose. You have pressure that comes in, and then it narrows the stream down, and then you get a high velocity that comes out on the smaller end. So with the injector, you have steam that comes into the top. The steam goes through a series of cones and produces a high velocity steam jet that shoots up the delivery pipe into the boiler check and into the boiler. Now, as that steam goes through the nozzle, it brings with it water that's from the tender that mixes with the steam, and then those go in a high velocity to push the boiler check open. This is all controlled by the fireman. Up on top of the boiler is our two dynamos that I spoke of previously in order to generate 32 volts electricity. And in front of the dynamos is what's called a continuous blowdown. This is a device that we added, and it's part of your water treatment program. So as you're putting water into the boiler is boiling the water off and it's turning to steam. Your water is not pure that's coming in. It has minerals and other contaminants and things in with it. As the water boils off, it turns to steam. Only the water is carried off in the form of steam. All of those contaminants stay behind. And so as you're constantly adding more water, those contaminants build up concentrations inside the boiler. They lead to scale, which forms on the side of your tubes and your tube sheets and causes barriers for heat transfer and as insulation. And it basically can also just lead to crap, which settles down in the bottom of your boiler, at the bottom of your firebox, which is called the mud ring, because that's where your mud is supposed to settle down to. So we've got a couple ways in order to get that stuff out of the boiler. On the side of the boiler, we have what's called a bottom blow valve, which is opened by the engine crew, and that blows a jet of steam and water out the side of the boiler. And then we also have a continuous blowdown, which we turn on and we leave on, and that takes a small amount of water from your mud ring, runs it up through a centrifugal pot up at the top of the boiler. The steam exhausts to atmosphere, and the water runs down onto the track. Now in front of those is your safeties and your whistle. And in front of that is your steam dome. That's where your actual throttle is located. Now, what you see there is you see a cap on top of the steam dome. The dome itself is an integral part of the boiler. It's an opening, a domed opening on the top of the boiler. Your hottest, driest steam rises to the top. That's where your throttle valve is located, which is inside the boiler. It's controlled by a rod that runs through the boiler to the engineer side. And when you open the throttle, then steam flows down through the dry pipe to the cylinders. And I discussed that more in depth in my video on steam locomotive drafting systems. In front of the steam dome is the sand dome. That's the one that says 4960 on the side. 4960 holds about 2,600 pounds of sand. And there's an air nozzle that takes the sand and jets it down through pipes to deposit the sand in front of the drive wheels for traction, and that's controlled by the engineer. 4960 has two cross compound air pumps, one on either side. These are used to pump up the air for the brake system. And these are steam driven, and the steam will enter into the upper right hand chamber to start with. And you have high pressure steam going into this chamber. Let's say it's at the steam is at 190 pounds per square inch. It's going to push on a piston. The piston is connected to a rod, which is connected to another piston on the bottom right side. And that's where it's going to compress your initial stage for your air. So let's say if you've got steam at 190 pounds or 200 pounds going into the top corner, and then it's going to pump air up to, let's say, hypothetically 60 pounds in the first air cylinder. Then that steam, after it goes in at 200 pounds, by the time it pushes that piston, let's say now it's down to about 100 pounds of pressure because it's done some work and it's expanded. That steam is now going to go into another piston on the left-hand side, the upper left-hand side, and notice that's a larger diameter piston. Force is pressure times surface area. So we've got less pressure going in there, 100 pounds instead of 200 pounds. So we have more surface area in order to get the same amount of force or more force. Now, same thing on the air side. On the bottom left, you're going into a smaller diameter piston. So you're taking your 60-pound air that comes out of the right-hand side, putting it into a smaller diameter piston. So a smaller surface area is now going to compress that air up to 140 pounds per square inch to go into your main reservoirs. And we've got 3 actual tanks on 4960, 2 on the left and 1 on the right. And we run those at 140 pounds per square inch. And that feeds the air supply for the brake systems, also for the bell ringer and the sanders and other things that run pneumatically. Moving forward again, we see a lot of steam leaking out of the bottom of the locomotive, and this is from the lubricators. So we've got multiple lubrication points along the locomotive and multiple mechanical lubricators, and these need to be heated. The oil needs to be heated in order to get it to flow well. So we use steam in order to flow through the lubricators in order to preheat the oil so that it flows better, and then the steam becomes just exhausts out the bottom of the locomotive, and that's what you see venting right here. So each air compressor has a lubricator for it, for both steam oil and also for air oil. But this lubricator here up at the front is for a lubricant that we call PB&J, which stands for pin, bearing, and journal oil. We have 2 PB&J lubricators on the locomotive, one here and one on the engineer side we'll take a look at in a little bit. This one lubricates your crosshead, which is the sliding motion here that connects your piston to your main rod. And it lubricates your shoes and wedges. Your shoes and wedges are part of the suspension system and allows the wheels to go up and down when you hit joints in the track. PB&J is specially formulated by a company specifically for use on steam locomotives. And one thing to keep in mind with steam locomotives is all of your lubricants are lost. It's a lost motion system, a lost lubricant system. Your lubricant goes into a bearing, gets used by the bearing moves back and forth, and eventually the lubricant works its way out of the bearing and it goes out onto the ground or into the environment. So the PB&J is formulated with what's called a tackifier, and a tackifier is something that makes it very sticky. And the fact that it's very sticky helps to hold that oil in the bearing longer so that you get more use out of the oil before it ends up on the ground. And then therefore, hopefully you use a little bit less oil because it lasts a little bit longer. Now there's two different formulations of PB&J. There's a mineral version, which is made out of petroleum products, and then there's a biodegradable version. We chose to use the biodegradable version, which is made out of animal fats, because all of this lubricant is ending up on the ground and it's better for the environment. I believe there's only a couple steam operations in the country that use the biodegradable version. The mineral version is used quite commonly in steam locomotives, but we're one of the few that use the biodegradable version. Now here at the bottom of the cylinders is the cylinder cocks. This is used in order to blow condensate out of your cylinders when you're first getting started until things get warmed up. Your steam goes into the cylinders, and as the steam cools off, it condenses and forms water droplets. And if you have too much water building in the bottom of your cylinders, water does not compress. And so if the locomotive is moving and the piston reaches the end of its stroke and the water is not compressing, then it builds up too much pressure and it could cause you to blow out the cylinder head. So when you're first getting the locomotive moving, you open up the cylinder cocks in order to get the water out of the bottom until everything gets good and heated and the steam is nice and dry. Well, I hope you've been enjoying this in-depth look at the 4960. If you've made it this far, I guess you've probably glued to your seats. Well, I'm going to break it off right here. This video is getting kind of long. This is going to be the end of part 1. Stay tuned. Next week, I'll release part 2, where I'm going to talk more about the feed water system, lubrication, and we're going to take a look inside the cab. So come back and join us.